This is the weekly review for the week of August 1st to August 5th, as well as this week's Sunday preparation. So, coming into the week on EU, we had what I was initially anticipating, which was a move up from the weekly opening price to take this equal highs buy side liquidity, as well as these equal highs buy side liquidity, which was also a weekly high up here. Um, the thing I didn't know was how deep we were going to, come into this daily fair value gap. Um, but we essentially just ended up slightly coming up into premium before having displacement to the downside, breaking market structure. So overall, logically, it was very clean in terms of the weekly structure. You have the weekly opening price here. We traded up to form the high of the week, and then the bulk of the volume was on the downside here, and we closed as a bearish week. So the power 3 structure of the weekly candle was definitely logical in my mind. So starting off on Monday I was still waiting for a bias, and we took the first set of equal highs here, and this up here was the second set of equal highs and the weekly high. So I noted that even though we took these equal highs, I was kind of just watching for a bearish setup, but there was no SMT here, number one, and number two, there was no fair value gap to short on the way down here. And I eventually started looking for a long after I saw this displacement up, how we had a H1 break in market structure, and this was a OTE and return to H1 order block here. Now, on GU, I initially ended up taking a short because we did form a setup on GU with taking previous day's high and had the break in market structure displacement, and I was simply just targeting the top of this M15 fair value gap in discount here, just like EU came into discount obviously in this OTE, but GU ended up being so bullish that we didn't even come into discount, right? So the reason I was just targeting discount was that was just the lowest hanging fruit. Like if we were bullish, we would want to long in discount, but obviously GU never ended up getting into discount, and I got stopped out here. And that's when I saw on EU that we formed a new setup coming, taking some short-term liquidity here and having a displacement and forming the mentorship setup. Now, in terms of my targeting, it wasn't the best because I was initially targeting these weekly or the weekly high up here, but I didn't take any partials just because I kind of was a little bit greedy on this trade, and I should have taken a partial here at the low-hanging fruit and then another partial here at the buy side liquidity, the high of the day. But what ended up happening is I just ended up closing the trade on this candle here once I saw this retracement after taking the low-hanging fruit. And I've seen that happen a lot of times just psychologically for like many months. Like you take the same mentorship setup trade and you see it take the low-hanging fruit, and you know you should take a partial here, but you don't want to because you're greedy. And then you just see this thing retracing, and you're like, fuck, is this going to, come down and stop me out? So that's why it's so important to take partials for me. And I noted that in my journal for this day in terms of an error that I made. So yeah, that was Monday. I had a small gain here on Monday. Now, coming into Tuesday ended up being a very sloppy day. So overnight in Asia, we took the weekly high here, and we formed an SMT with GU, and then broke market structure to the downside, creating this H1 fair value gap. So still, I didn't have a firm grasp on the bias for the week, but I saw that we formed a bullish setup here. We took previous day's low with SMT, and then we broke market structure to the upside. And my logic here was that regardless if we're bullish or bearish, we should trade up into premium of the daily range. So from the low that we created prior to the break in market structure to the high of the day that was made. Because if we're bearish, we would want to take this equal high liquidity here, come into premium, and short inside this H1 fair value gap. So that's why I thought, regardless of the higher time frame bias, this trade should have played out to this low-hanging fruit liquidity here. And everything was going clean in terms of we took the low-hanging fruit of the setup here, the swing high prior to the RTO, and then we broke that market structure. But then we completely fell off a cliff. And the reason for that was because GU ended up doing what I was anticipating EU to do if we were bearish. GU traded up into its fair value gap and formed a bearish setup here. Now, obviously the confirmation of the bearish setup with the break in market structure coincided with me being stopped out here. So once I got stopped out, I was trying to reevaluate what price was going to do, and I ended up taking the short on GU here. Same setup as always. We had a SMT after taking liquidity, break in market structure, and here's a fair value gap in premium. And I shorted this with a stop right here above this high, and the bias ended up being correct. I was targeting previous day's low because I saw that this SMT was broken here from EU, so EU ended up trading lower, so I figured that GU was going to follow suit and take previous day's low, which it ended up doing, but it did after London close, like well after, like 2 p.m. And in the process, I got stopped out here. I don't know what price was reaching for up here, but it completely violated this fair value gap, which I didn't feel was clean. So this was like a really sloppy day, and I took 2 losses here, even though one of them, the bias was correct. Then Wednesday is when we had a very nice day. Wednesday I figured that the bias was going to be bearish because of Tuesday's price action with this huge displacement down. And then Wednesday we had the setup inside rating a high, London high, inside this H4 fair value gap, inside premium of previous day's displacement range, and then we just formed a beautiful setup here with price reaching for the fair value gap breaker and order block, as well as above the 12 a.m. opening price. So I took one partial here inside this fair value gap and this sell side liquidity here, which was in discount of the raid range. So just from that low to that high here, I took a partial here, and then I was targeting previous day's low. I took another partial below London low, and then I closed the rest of the position at previous day's low. And the reason I was targeting previous day's low was because I was bearish, and if we're bearish, previous day's high should stay intact, and we should target previous day's low. I also set a limit for this institutional order flow entry drill, but I got swerved by 0.4 pips. It was at just a 25% level, and price just literally tapped a little bit above the high and didn't fill me. Um, then we had about a 30 pip raid of previous day low before price ended up reversing with breaking market structure here and came back down into this fair value gap to form the power 3 London close setup. I was watching for this, but I kind of missed this fair value gap here, and I didn't really start looking at price until we were like around this area. But even if I saw this, I wouldn't have gotten a fill because price only came 0.1 pip into the fair value gap. So even if I had set a limit here, it would not have been triggered. But in terms of the logic behind the day, I think this was just a classic sell day, and I think this, from what I've seen, is the pattern that, or the daily template that I understand the best, because just looking at these 3 trades, you can absolutely milk this day. If you're able to get in on the raid, get in again on a compound entry of the institutional order flow entry drill, and then get in at the power 3 London close reversal setup. So really this is something like a template I want to keep in mind, because as I said, I understand this the best. The only thing is I don't know how to anticipate a day like this. So that's something that I want to keep in mind as I'm journaling. But really, if I could just trade this day or this daily template, I think that would be beautiful. Now, coming into Thursday, I did not really understand Thursday's price action that well. I was still had a bearish bias, which is why I ended up taking a short, but I felt that this short was just kind of rushed. And I took a partial here, and then when price came back up to break even, I just closed the trade because I didn't really have a draw on liquidity. Really, I just took a partial here and then left the rest on to see where it would go, and that really wasn't good. But this was Thursday, so we had high impact news on GU, which was the Bank of England raising their interest rates. So for GU, actually, initially, I thought we were in a market maker buy model prior to Thursday's Bank of England news. And I thought this was the smart money reversal. But once I saw price initially trade up from the news to take previous day's high, I kind of scrapped that idea. And obviously I saw price trading lower. But there was really no setup on GU. So really I was just watching GU go down. And then we had obviously that SMT with previous day's high. EU did not take previous day's high. And we formed a setup here inside the M5 breaker from yesterday. So the M5 breaker that I shorted on Wednesday. We came back up into it and had that SMT with previous day's high and displacement down. So that's where I shorted, and then took a partial here. But as I said, this wasn't really a clean trade for me to take. I think it was just more lucky than anything, so I don't really count it. And then in terms of a long, I didn't really see anything in terms of what we were reaching for. There was really no setup for a long here. The break in market structure is here, and this didn't really retrace into discount, so this really was not clean price action. But if we look on the higher time frame chart, price wanted to retrace up to this H1 fair value gap that I was expecting to happen on Tuesday. So I had that long on Tuesday anticipating for price to come up here, which we didn't. And we ended up revisiting that on Thursday. Which is still kind of tricky in my mind because, right, I was bearish on Wednesday, and then we see this gigantic rally up, but we're still bearish. So this is still tricky for me and can sometimes like knock me around, the fact that they can run price up so much and it still be bearish on the following day. But yeah, there was no clean setup for Thursday. And then Friday was non-farm payroll. There was nothing for EU, but GU did have actually a setup now that I look back at it. So GU retraced into its H1 fair value gap from the rate adjustment news on Thursday. And this was also like a dealing range. We took buy side and sell side, and price retraced into premium of the dealing range and fell off. But prior to NFP, we actually had a setup where GU took Asia high, had displacement. It wasn't the cleanest, and we had the break in market structure here. And a fair value gap here on the M5. And it eventually, it wasn't exactly in premium. That's why it wasn't a super clean setup, but combined with the context of everything else, that we had this Judas swing inside the H1 fair value gap and it had a setup, I feel like it would have been reasonably logical if you took this prior to NFP. And especially because right below price were these equal lows. So my bias for NFP was bearish just because of these lows here. EU didn't have anything. So my bias was purely bearish for these lows on GU. And I think this honestly would have been a logical setup to take. Then we had the classic Friday low of the week reversal power 3 trade where we break market structure here, come back to the fair value gap, and price returns to premium of the daily range or the displacement range here. So this was clean. I took a demo trade for EU of the same setup, even though EU did not make the low of the week on Friday. The trade ended up playing out, but if I took it live, I would have been stopped out because I put my stop loss below the fair value gap low, and we didn't respect the fair value gap at all. So a stop loss below this swing low would have been better. But overall, this week was pretty clean in my opinion. Going into next week, on EU, I don't see anything super clear because we're still in a consolidation and we're at the mean threshold of that about in this dealing range from this high here to this low here. So we took buy or sell side here, and then we took buy side here. So I just mapped that as a dealing range, and we're pretty much at equilibrium. But if I look at DXY, to me, DXY looks bullish because it's doing what I was anticipating for the last couple weeks, coming down into this fair value gap in discount of the daily dealing range into this order block, and now we have bullish displacement away from it. So since this looks bullish, I feel like these relative equal highs in this daily fair value gap are going to be the draw on liquidity for the week, which obviously would make the bias on foreign currency bearish. Um, but yeah, just looking at this, I personally feel that I have a high degree of confidence in this being bullish. And here we broke market structure, came back down into this H4 fair value gap, and started trading up away from it. So I feel like we could have some type of retracement into here, right? So if this week is going to be bullish, it should trade down from the weekly opening price. And if we look at the news, Monday and Tuesday are quiet, and then we have the big news on Wednesday, which is CPI. Thursday is PPI, but that usually doesn't move. And then we have consumer sentiment. I honestly don't remember if this does anything, but it's still high impact news. So the fact that we have the first high impact news on Wednesday, which is CPI, and that's big, that's going to create a big move. I assume that the low of the week is going to form on Wednesday, with the high of the week forming on Wednesday for foreign currency. I noted these equal highs up here just above the non-farm payroll move down, so maybe EU can take those before going lower and taking previous week's low. But yeah, as of right now, that's what I'm anticipating is a move down from the weekly opening price that starts on Sunday, and then up to this daily fair value gap up here, and then for EU, a move up from the weekly opening price, maybe back up into this H1 fair value gap, create some type of SMT up here, and take these equal highs, and then trade lower to at least take previous week's low, and then potentially this low. Now, I still have this fair value gap noted because ICT said in one of his commentaries that this is kind of the turning point if we're going to be bullish or bearish on EU. If we break this fair value gap, we're going to come for this low. So I'm going to be watching that next week to see if we're bearish and we break below this fair value gap. But yeah.